Now, the man in the hot seat, both in terms of the government's re-election chances and in holding his own seat of Kooyong in Melbourne, is the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg. I caught up with him earlier today and started by asking him about the stubbornness of the polls and whether he had real fears about losing government.
Well, we know we started this election campaign behind and that it will be close, and there will be some pretty interesting battles in different parts of the country, but we also know it's a very clear choice for the Australian people, and as they get closer to election day on the 21st of May, that choice will be even more clearer. And that is a Liberal national coalition that has helped deliver one of the fastest and strongest economic recoveries anywhere in the world out of COVID, one of the lowest mortality rates and one of the highest vaccination rates, with a plan that I set out in the budget to lower taxes, to create more jobs in manufacturing, to invest in apprentices and new skills training, and to back small businesses. And a Labor Party led by Anthony Albanese, who stumbled and mumbled his way through the election campaign to date, not even knowing the unemployment rate or the interest rate, and has spent a career championing higher taxes, from a congestion tax to a carbon tax, a mining tax, to death duties, to superannuation tax, to high taxes on people's family businesses, retirees and housing. And that's the very clear choice, Chris, that Australians will face in just a few weeks' time.
There are a lot of threats when it comes to foreign policy and national security interests, and we'll cover those elsewhere in the program. But I also want to hear your thoughts on the economic headwinds, just what we could be facing as a country in the next year, the next 3 years, when it comes to global economic conditions, because it seems that we're going to see increasing interest rate rises in the US, and they're going to have to happen in Australia very, very soon.
Well, the first thing to say is that Australia right now is in a very strong economic position. I say that because we've avoided what the economists call the scarring of the labour market, which has been so reminiscent in Australia's previous recessions in the 1980s and the 1990s. Unlike then, when the unemployment remained elevated for up to a decade, this time round we have an unemployment rate which is lower than what it was going into the pandemic. We know that Australian businesses and households have saved more than $400 billion on their balance sheets that was not there at the start of the pandemic. That will spur economic activity. We know there's a strong pipeline of investment plan both in the mining and the non-mining sectors. We know that Australia is capitalising on the growing middle class in the region by investing more in agricultural production, which we're helping to secure access to new markets with free trade agreements like we did with India just very recently. So the economy is in a good position. But there are some black swan events that could take place. Firstly, you could obviously have new variants of COVID, because we're not out of the pandemic just yet, and that could of course be damaging. At the same time, you could have broader conflict within Europe, and we're all very concerned about the events in the Ukraine, where autocracies are battling with democracies, and the potential for spillover effects into other countries. And then, as you say, we're seeing inflation being higher than what was previously forecast, and that has been driven as a result of international factors. With respect to COVID, we've seen higher freight costs, in some cases increasing fivefold since the beginning of the pandemic. And with respect to Ukraine, we're seeing higher fuel and gas prices and oil prices, as well as higher commodity prices like wheat, which again flows through to the supermarket shelves or the bowsers here in Australia. So we are seeing higher inflation. We will see monetary policy normalise over the time, but we're also going to see potentially some black swan events, which Australia has to be very cautious about.
You talk about monetary policy being normalised. That means interest rates going up. Now, we've seen clarity from the US now that they're going to see some substantial interest rate increases over the coming months. We've seen that's contributed to the fall on stock markets today. You're going to get new inflation figures out tomorrow. The Reserve Bank Board is meeting today week. Do you expect that we will see Australia's cash rate increased next Tuesday, notwithstanding the fact that it's going to be right in the middle of an election campaign?
Well, Chris, it's not for me to speculate as the Treasurer on a decision on monetary policy and interest rates, which is one for the independent board of the Reserve Bank, other than to point you to their previous statements where they have been cautious about future interest rate rises, wanting to see inflation steadily within that band that they've set, but also to see upward pressure on wages. Now, inflation in Australia today is at 3.5%, and we get the inflation rate tomorrow, and it's likely to be higher than that. But it's still well below where other countries are at, like the United Kingdom, which is at 7%, like what we're seeing in Canada at around 6.7, a bit higher in New Zealand, and then in the United States at 8.5%.
But if they don't increase, if the Reserve Bank doesn't increase interest rates next week, won't they just make the job harder and harder for themselves? A lot of commentators have suggested they should have already increased interest rates. So perhaps they ought to get started next week rather than wait till a month later when, of course, you've got another month of inflation running unchecked.
Well, they will be decisions for the independent board, but what I can tell you is that the Labor Party will spend more and has committed to spending more than we have, some $300 billion in sort of aspirational promises and commitments that they are pointing to. Now, that would put only upward pressure on interest rates and unnecessarily on inflation. We know that Labor wanted us to continue to spending on programs like JobKeeper and programs like the COVID disaster payments that we brought to an end when it was the right time to do so. In fact, Anthony Albanese said when I brought JobKeeper to an end that the economic roof would come crashing down, even though within the 3 months after that decision by the government, 120,000 more jobs were created. So he really doesn't have an economic plan for Australia. He's very uncomfortable around economic statistics and the economic debate. And his idea of a new economic initiative is to spray $6 billion to pay people to get the jab, even though they've had the jab. So, there is no contest between his economic position and that is being proposed by Scott Morrison and myself.